who are regular visitors to the library, welcome back. And if you're not, if this is your first time, welcome for your first time to see the library. This is Allison Butler, and she's a professor at UMass Amherst in media communications. Okay. And she's going to help us wade through news to separate truth from untruth, because we're seeing an awful lot of fake news and alternative facts and all sorts of fun things like that. So, thank you, Allison.
Thank you so much for having me. And I heard you saying that you hope to hear a little bit about CNN and how CNN is fake news. And I'm going to kind of disappoint you. We're not really going to spend that much time on CNN. But hopefully what we do talk about will give you some information to think more about CNN. And I think that's sort of where, that's kind of where I come from, is I'm not necessarily here to give you the answers, because I don't think there is one set of them. But instead what I'd like to do is provide some context and then give you some questions to ask of your own media use. And that's part of what's on the handout that I have for you, which you're more than welcome to take at the end. Just, it's hard to keep up these days. It's really, really hard to keep up. Things in the news and in our information and our entertainment are happening so fast. So that's another thing that we'll be doing, is sort of trying to pause, take a little bit of a break, and see what's happening. What we're going to cover in this time is, I'm going to give you a definition, start with a definition of critical media literacy. This is the work that I do. This will give you some information on sort of how I enter into this topic. We'll do a brief review of the 2016 election along with some updates, just to kind of get us all in the same frame of thinking. And then we'll go over some definitions, including the definition of fake news, and ways in which it has been used correctly and incorrectly, because it's become catchphrase, and that might not be so helpful for us. And then I'll go over some critical questions to evaluate mainstream/corporate and alternative news. That's the handout, so that you don't have to in any way, shape, or form memorize the questions, but that you can take that with you. And then look at some case studies of how we might consider trustworthy news, fake news, satire, and propaganda. So to start with the definition, what is critical media literacy? In the United States, in 1992, a group met at a place called the Aspen Institute, which is how how this name came about. It's a group of American scholars who felt that it was really time to start thinking about how young people could critically address the media. And so they came up with this definition, published in 1993, the ability to access, analyze, and produce a variety of media. There's obviously a lot more to that, but just briefly, access is both about what we have. We have radio, TV, film, we have social media. It's also what we can have access to, right? We happen to live in a part of the world where we have relatively easy access to a variety of media. This, of course, isn't the case around the globe. So it's not only our own personal access, what we choose to, but also what is available to us. To analyze is the way in which we approach it. It's the questions that we ask of our media. It's the questions that we ask of our information, so that we aren't just accepting it as is. And then to produce, when we're looking at the definition in the 1990s of production, part of what was being thought of was how to get young people engaged in, at the time, video production, as a way of making their learning more experiential and multidimensional, under the argument that if you are creating your own media, you have an idea, you are building knowledge on how it is created. We're not as interested these days in video production as in video cameras, because most of us can do so much of that on our phones. We also have expanded the definition of production to include social media, right? When you are uploading a video on YouTube or posting a set of pictures on Instagram or Pinterest or our postings on Facebook, we are providing the content, right? So that is a form of production. And it also doesn't ever have to be high tech. I do a lot of work with my undergraduate students in production where we're doing arts and crafts, right? We're cutting and pasting. I have 22-year-old college seniors who are, super jaded and kind of totally done with it all. And then I bring out the glue sticks and the markers and they're so excited. And even something as simple as glue sticks and scissors and pens and paper can help teach us, oh, this is a text that has to be made. And so that's an opening way to begin to ask questions of our media. To talk about critical media literacy is to explore the behind the scenes of ownership, production, and distribution. It's an exploration of power. It's not simply sticking with the content and what's on the screen, but instead looking behind that and saying, hey, how did we get this? Who produced this? Who owns it? How did it get distributed? What's their motivation? Right? What is their goal? For the most part in the United States, our media are private, for-profit companies, and one of their number one goals is to make money. This isn't necessarily a bad or a good thing. I don't want to start off by putting a value judgment on it, but I think it's one of those things that as a critical media literacy scholar, we think it's really important to do that behind the scenes work. How did our media get to us? To work with media literacy is to engage in a process of continuous critical inquiry. What is known about the text? How is this known? What is the context for understanding the text, right? Our texts don't just appear to us out of nowhere, and they do appear to us in a context. And how do we know what we know? This is one of those things that in my classroom drives my students relentlessly mad, because they'll talk about something, I'll say, how did you know that? And how do you know that? And how do you know that? And we're going on a little detective work. Outside of UMass, I co-run an organization called Mass Media Literacy. We work with teachers on teacher training in media literacy and curriculum development. And what we work through are a series of concepts and understandings so that we can break down our analysis of the media into these categories of construction and deconstruction, how the media are put together, and then how we can take them apart. Audience, which is of course self-exploration. Who are we as audience members? Why are we audiences to these texts? Industry and context is the behind the scene, that's the ownership, and then distribution and production. How do these texts get to the audiences? Right, and so a couple of questions, a couple of statements within that. We have a lot more detail within these to explain them more, but just to give you an idea, we're looking at this as a way of breaking down some of the really complicated stuff that's out there right now. So how do we make sense of the current news and information environment? The election was swiftly characterized as part of a post-truth environment. Right? I think since the election, we've become really comfortable using a lot of these phrases, and so kind of like to go back in time a little bit to see where they came from. And then the inauguration we saw is analyzed through alternative facts, particularly numbers of people who attended the inauguration. Post-truth as a term is an adjective. It relates to or denotes circumstances in which objective facts are less influential, right? Less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. Right? So when we're looking at something like post-truth, it's the idea that we could be presented with something that, for argument's sake, is a truth, a fact, but we refute it because what we're looking for is an appeal to our emotions. The term post-truth is used seriously by pundits and critics to discuss our apparent comfort with false information, again, as long as it feeds our emotions, and then it's used humorously by comedians to critique the presentation of quote-unquote news. Stephen Colbert was well known for this when he was still doing the Colbert Report, where he would talk about, he had a segment called Truthiness, right? And that was sort of playing around with, sort of mocking this notion of our false information that still, feels pretty good. Fake news is something that we've heard a lot about, but I want to sort of parse it down to its definitions, because I think sometimes what we're dealing with is we hear it used as an accusation, we hear it used in ways that don't actually refer to what it is intended to mean, right? Information that is clearly and demonstrably fabricated, packaged and distributed to appear as legitimate news, right? Fake news is something we started hearing about in the election, but it's been going on for a long time, right? When we look at the history of journalism, and we look at what was called yellow journalism, that was fake news. So it's nothing brand new. It's just gotten a lot more popular in the past several months. But what we want to think about when evaluating a news source is whether or not it is patently false, right? Demonstrably fabricated, created and presented in a way meant to deceive consumers into thinking it is real. That's us, the consumers, right? It refers to a specific piece of information. It does not refer to any particular type of news outlet, individual, or other actor. This, by the way, definition is from MediaMatters.org, in case you wanted to look into some more of what they're about. I'm going to use their definitions for a few things here. Making sense of satire. Satire is writing or art designed to make social commentary based on mockery and imitation of real-life events or actors. So a really great example of satire would be The Onion or Saturday Night Live. Has anybody kept up with their Saturday Night Live viewing over the past few months? If we have time, we can watch a clip of it, but it's not necessary. But the purpose here is to entertain or inspire rather than to deceive. Part of what makes satire work is that you and I are in on the joke, right? There's a joke that's being made and you and I are in on it. So we're included in that context. And generally speaking, when we're included in something, when we're invited to be a part of something, we might be paying more attention to it. Propaganda. Misleading or highly biased information specifically designed to confirm or promote a particular ideological viewpoint. It originates from politically motivated actors. The intent is to drive public discussion. It's a part, but not exclusively separate from financial and ideological gain, right? A lot of folks can stand to make a lot of money out of propaganda. It can be packaged, especially these days, as fake news, with the result is both patently false and designed to appear real. I want to add a quick caveat to fake news. As I said before, it's now this generic umbrella term to mean what the user wants it to mean. It's used to denigrate opinions, beliefs, facts, or feelings different from the user. Therefore, I can label anything I don't like fake news, and that's the end of the conversation, which I would argue isn't exactly helpful, right? That doesn't inform us or get us anywhere. According to Sullivan in the New York Times, actual fake news is made up of deliberately constructed lies. So that's what we're looking at with fake news. Patently false, demonstrably fabricated, deliberately constructed. In the January 2017 pre-inauguration press conference, and here's where we get into CNN, my friend. President-elect would not answer a CNN reporter's question on Russian intelligence hacking, calling the whole organization fake news, right? This attack threatens the basic premise of a free and independent press because it's not the organization itself isn't fake news, it's the information, right? And that's a distinction that we want to be thinking about. And I'm not going to pretend that that's an easy distinction. I'm not going to stand up here and go, yeah, and once you figure this out, it's super easy. Believe me, it's tricky for me too. We have to think about looking at the information versus the organization, and I think that's where the critical part of media literacy is helpful, because looking at that behind the scenes, at the ownership, production, and distribution can help us make some of those distinctions. Since the inauguration, Kellyanne Conway and Press Secretary Sean Spicer have adopted the term alternative facts to reinterpret what might be considered non-flattering events. And as we are now 5 months into the current administration, fake news and alternative facts are firmly part of our lexicon. And I think we're having an increasingly difficult time feeling confident in actual news. And I put actual in quotes intentionally because it's very hard these days to figure out what is actually happening. Why does this matter? It matters in part because of, and not exclusively, but certainly in part because of social media. Social media has enabled news, however we want to understand that term, to be updated immediately and constantly. And it puts pressure on news organizations to always have new information, right? So there was a time, this time is pretty long gone, but there was a time on television news where the news was on at 6 p.m., let's say, and then it was over at 6:30. That was usually probably our local news. Then there would be a time pretty soon after that where you would have your national news, right? And later on would be kind of discussion, something that took a little bit more time. But then we would be done with our television news. Once we start getting 24-hour news cycles on cable, it's never done. It's constant. And I don't want to, believe me, I don't feel bad for the 24-hour news shows, or 24-hour cable stations, but they have to fill 24 hours no matter what, right? So, and I can sometimes succumb to this as well. You know, the morning of the election, I'm turning the television on, I'm turning the news on. I know the polls aren't even open when I'm awake, but I'm turning it on just in case, because it's enticing that way, right? And then it's all day before, at least in Massachusetts, we don't start getting actual information until 9 o'clock at night. But they've got to fill that time. Social media is even more pressure because it's a constant stream. It's super easy to access, and there are so many different sites. An increasing number of us get our news through social media sites, and established mainstream or corporate news organizations must compete in a crowded field with less trust. We as a population have less trust in our news anchors. Social media and a broader reliance on web-based information has invited non-legitimate sources to prosper. This is one of the good things, bad things, double-edged sword about the internet, right? The internet is a little bit of like the wild, wild west. It is very difficult to regulate it. There are powers that be that are trying very hard to regulate it. However, if we look at their motivations, those are largely about profit and making sure that they have the best access and will make the most money. What's great about the internet is that it means that there's a lot of opportunity for small businesses, for individuals, for startups to prosper. That also means that there's a lot of opportunity for stuff that's patently false and demonstrably fabricated to also prosper. Anybody in here on Facebook? Okay, so one of the things that I know I do with Facebook is I get on Facebook and I sort of hit the down arrow and just sort of let all the stuff scroll, right? And occasionally I'll pause if there's something I want to see, pictures that a friend posted, or I'm a huge sucker for like cute dog videos, that kind of stuff. But I'll just fly through it. And I'm not a big social media user. Facebook is pretty much the only thing I'm on. Teaching undergraduate students, I see them constantly. They're swiping through Facebook, they're looking through Instagram, they've got their Pinterest, they're doing Snap stories. It's all happening kind of all at the same time. I don't see how any of us can keep up. So one of my encouragements in this work is, as I said, that what we would do, but what I would also encourage us as news viewers, readers, listeners, etc., is to slow down, to slow that scroll, because the headlines can be very enticing, but that's not necessarily the information. And because of the unregulated quality of the internet, those headlines can just not mean anything at all, but the words are catchy, and that's maybe what sticks in the brain, right? And then again, you add on the exponential quantity of social media that we could be on, and there's even more that is just rushing through our brains, and how much time are we taking to dissect it, to take it apart? So how do we apply critical media literacy? Questions to ask of any current event. And this is replicated on the handout along with some news sources if you want to sort of get outside of the mainstream news sources. Who are the subjects? What are their positions? Who are their supporters or detractors? Right? So we're asking questions of the text here. Who is covering the story? Is it mainstream corporate media, or is it an alternative, non-traditional source? If mainstream, who owns the sites and what is their motivation and goal? And if alternative or non-traditional, what systems do they have in place that encourage us to trust their coverage? We'll play around with that a little bit in just a moment. Who or what are the sources? I'm not trained as a journalist, right? I'm trained as a media literacy scholar, but I have been listening a lot lately to the news talking about the number of leaks coming out of the White House and the anonymous sources. Generally speaking, in journalism, an anonymous source is really only acceptable if that person, that source's life or livelihood or job is at stake. We're seeing a lot more anonymous news sources and a lot more anonymous links. I don't know if they're trustworthy or not. That's part of this evaluative process. But it does seem to me that this might be something that we think about in this administration, especially with all the things that are happening right now with the potential for scandals with Russia and voter fraud and so on and so forth. It's hard sometimes to know who the sources are. And so that's another way that we're not necessarily going to walk out of here with all of the answers, but even in asking the question and then saying, wait a minute, how come I can't find out this answer, might reveal some information for us. What is their motivation, their interest? To whom are they writing or broadcasting? That is, who is the intended audience? And via what medium. Intended audience doesn't necessarily mean it's the exact audience, but it can help us figure out maybe some of the motivation. Evaluate language and images. What is the word choice? What is the emphasis? Is it a positive or negative picture, right? If we want to create a story where we want to put somebody in a negative light, a bad picture will do that before the text even has to be read, right? If we catch a public figure who we're trying to critique or criticize like in the middle of a sneeze, that's just never an attractive picture, but it's a great way to start to construct a negative story, right? Same thing with word choice. If we hear a word choice something like, over 500 people were at the protest, that sounds like a lot. But if the word choice is simply flipped to only 500 people were at the protest, now that's no big deal. That's little. That doesn't matter, right? So what is the word choice? What is the emphasis? And how do we begin to look at the images before we even get to the content? Probably before we even get to the content, it's possible that we already know what this story is going to be about. Looking around your neighborhood or community, what stories are not being reported? Why do you think this is so? And can you take steps to get a story coverage? This is a way of dealing with our own personal production, right? If I look around my community and I see something's happening and I'm not reading it in my local newspaper, why isn't that getting coverage? What's missing there? And is there anything I can do to get it coverage so that we do see a wide range of stories being told? So we begin with a baseline of trustworthy news, and we ask the questions of construction and deconstruction. Why was this story written or published? Right? I mean, it sounds like a really simple question, but I think it's an important starting point. Why are we reading about this, or watching this, or scrolling through this on our social media, or listening to it on the radio? Who published this story, and what might their position be if known? Again, sometimes not knowing the answer gives us some pretty valuable information. What reality does this story present? Right? I mean, is the world falling apart or is the world doing okay? Probably somewhere in between. But what reality are we being presented with? What techniques are used to convince us of the veracity of this story? Again, that's like language and image choice, what the headline looks like. Looking at ourselves, who is the intended audience of this text and how is this known? According to the mass media, what is the, quote, correct response to this text? Again, that doesn't need to be our response. That's not how I read it, but what is the in quotes, correct? How are we supposed to read this? How are we supposed to? How should the audience behave? And what other interpretations might be available? In terms of industry and context, is this story about politics? And if so, how are politics discussed? We happen to be living in a time where you and I hear about politics a lot, right? I mean, it does seem like it's a nearly constant thing, but really big picture, not this specific time, not these days, these months, these weeks, but big picture, politics isn't something that gets discussed all that much. This is one of the things we're hearing now is that C-SPAN is having record numbers of people watching C-SPAN. It's literally cameras in Congress. It's just cameras, right? They're not producing shows. What are we watching? Did you want to have a question?
Yeah, it's very boring. It's just a bunch of cameras just sitting there, just watching a bunch of people.
C-SPAN.
Yeah, it's just a big round table.
Yeah.
And I heard about the story about this father punished her daughter by making her watch C-SPAN for 7 hours.
For 7 hours. But we're watching it. I know. Why is it interesting these days to just sit around and watch people walk in and out of a room, have a little bit of a conversation? We used to never pay attention to it, but we are. Newspapers are seeing their subscriptions go up. C-SPAN is seeing their audience members go up. We are now very interested in this conversation in a way that we haven't been for many years. Again, as a big picture thing, maybe individually we've been interested, but sort of on a big picture, right? What are the potential commercial gains or losses from this story, and who might profit, right? One of the things that we teach our students in a sort of, media studies 101 is that American media, generally speaking, American media are private for-profit companies, and their number one goal is money. Their number one goal is profit. And there used to be a phrase, it's still around, but it was sort of popular in the 80s and 90s, that we're delivering eyeballs to advertisers, right? That you and I are watching, we believe we're watching, reading, listening to content, but we're drawn in so that we're getting the advertisements. If you and I happen to be entertained along the way, excellent. but the number one goal is profit. We also live in a time where 90% of our information comes to us from 6 corporations. That's not a lot of diversity. That's not a lot of difference in our information. So some bodies are standing to profit greatly from our attention. Now you said, a couple of you raised your hands before and said that you were on Facebook. And so you post stuff on Facebook, I'm assuming, even if infrequently, or are you mostly just looking at stuff? Mostly you post stuff. Did anybody pay you? No. Wouldn't that be great?
I'd be posted all the time.
So, I used to teach this large lecture class at UMass, 300 students, and I would ask them when we were talking about social media, I'd ask how many of them are on Facebook, and they're all raising their hands. And I'd say, how many of you have a job? Many of them. Many UMass students have a job. How many of you get paid for your job? They're raising their hands. How many of you at the end of your pay cycle would say, hey boss, I don't need my paycheck today? And all their hands go down, right? And I was like, okay, look, nobody's gonna have their hands up, but let me just ask this question anyway. How many of you at the end of the pay cycle would not only say, hey boss, no worries, don't need my check today, but here, let me give you the money I have in my pocket, because you deserve it. And I have 300 people looking at me like I have 3 heads, right? That's part of what we do with social media, though. That's part of what we do on Facebook or any of the other social media sites is we're doing the labor. We're doing the work. We're posting the information. We're posting those pictures. We're posting our vacation pictures, right? And it feels good. It does. I just got back I was in New Hampshire for the weekend hiking in New Hampshire. I was super excited to post those pictures because it was a really hard hike. It was great that we got through the summit, right? It was so fun.
Is that where you got the sticker on your bottle?
That's where I got the sticker because I climbed Mount Washington a few times and it's so fun. And now I just did work for Mark Zuckerberg because I really like the pictures, right? So what are we doing when we're doing that kind of labor? We don't necessarily have commercial gain, but we certainly have time spent, right? We certainly have time spent. So how are we spending our time? When we look at distribution and production, how was this story published? And we can certainly include ourselves in that as well. And where was it found? Right, so that gives us an idea. These are questions that I say we ask of anything. But now let's play around with asking of stuff that is, again, clearly in this category. So one of the top fake news stories of the election, and I think it's probably taken, I keep this on here. I've given this talk many times, and I keep this on here because there's a couple of key things in here that I think are really helpful to understand. And maybe this is becoming more topical again after the president's international visit. But one of the top fake news stories of the election was the announcement that Pope Francis had endorsed a presidential candidate, right? Brouhaha. Pope has never done this before. So this is from WTOE 5 News in July of 2016. News outlets around the world are reporting on the news that Pope Francis has made the unprecedented decision to endorse a U.S. presidential candidate. Most of us saw this, if we saw it, most of us saw it on social media. WTOE5news.com, which by the way doesn't exist anymore, it was not a news site. This was an example of fake news. One of the easiest ways to figure out it was fake news outlets around the world are reporting. If you went to any other news outlet, they were not reporting. So here's one of those things where we look at the language. This is the easiest thing in the world. News outlets around the world are reporting. Great, I'm going to go look at other news outlets. No, they're not. No, they're not reporting. Yes?
I did see it on Yahoo News.
Yes, because this is what happened. You and I, probably not you and I, but a generic you and I, started sharing this all over. And so news outlets picked it up, but they weren't reporting on it, right? So it did, it got spread around past...
They told us, but they didn't report?
No, they just picked up this. They quoted that.
Okay, so what's the difference between quoting and reporting?
Going out and doing the job.
And how do we as consumers know that?
That's the tricky part. So one of the reasons why is anybody in here a Fox News viewer? Okay. So one of the ways in which that Roger Ailes made Fox News as prominent as he did was he had the belief that people don't want to be informed, they just want to feel like they're informed. And so what Fox News did was they hired a lot of people to talk about different things. And that's inexpensive, right? To hire somebody to sit behind a desk and talk about something is relatively inexpensive. What those folks weren't doing is they weren't going to the site to do the interviews. That's expensive, right? That takes a lot of work, that takes a lot of money. So we're seeing these talking heads, and that's hard for us to figure out. We as viewers, it took a long time for many of us to figure out, oh, these folks aren't on site. They are behind a desk telling me something, not necessarily going out and doing it. News outlets are also looking to pick up stories and to get more viewers. And so if you have the provocative story of an unprecedented decision to endorse a US presidential candidate, you might have more people reading it. That means more people are at your site. That means more people are seeing your advertisements. So to play around with this, what are the word choices or images for this story? And what is the source? Again, a relatively good place to begin is the URL. What's the website, right? So here's something that happens all too frequently. You and I might be familiar with something like abc.com or espn.com if you're interested in sports or so on and so forth. Okay. There have been stories that have been on sites that have no connection to espn.com, but they've clipped the ESPN logo and put it on a website. So again, you and I flashing through really quickly might think that that's ESPN. Or there was a point where abcnews.com dot a couple of other letters wasn't actually ABC News. Again, it was a clipped logo made up on a website. But really, look at the top. Does it say nytimes.com? Okay, it's probably the New York Times. If it says NYV, maybe that's a mistake. Maybe that's its own website, but you and I are still thinking like, oh, it looks like nytimes.com, right? So playing around, even starting with the URL can be really helpful. What tools of persuasion are used to make this story seem real? Well, it's evocative. It's enticing, right? The Pope has never done this before. That seems different. And that's a lot of what news is something different, something new, something that's happened. Audience. Who's the audience of this source? Why would they believe or disbelieve this story, right? Again, if we go through our social media super quickly, if we're just scrolling through it, how could we not notice that headline? And if that's all we pay attention to, then there it goes, right? What do we learn, and can it be verified from this story, right? So we have learned that the Pope has made this endorsement, but it cannot be verified. Right? We cannot go to a source, an established source like the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post. Or the Vatican's website, exactly. It will not be verified, right? And what level of truth must be understood in order to comprehend the story as false or fake? So that's also part of how we are involved in this, is what do we know? How else are we informed? Right? What else are we gathering information from our families, from our communities, from our local libraries, from our local news, etc., that give us, I would hope we don't get our information from just one source, that we want to be able to look at multiple sources. Look, in terms of industry and context, who stands to gain and what will they gain from publishing this story? Well, they got a lot of attention. It was a flash of attention. It was over very quickly, but it was a lot of attention. What else are we looking at or reading when we follow this fake story? Depending on the site, we are looking at advertisements. Right? We are seeing other products being advertised that might be catching our attention. And then how is this story accessed? Right? Where did I get this? If it flashes up in my social media feed, what is the source? Did I seek it out, or in a way did it seek me out? Okay. So playing around with satire. Are folks familiar here with The Onion? The Onion it used to be a printed newspaper, and now it's online. Calls itself the finest news source in the nation. It's all satire. Sometimes The Onion plays around with a lot of very silly different things. There was a piece in, I can never repeat The Onion and make it sound as funny as it is, but there was a piece sort of in kind of late March about how the crocuses bloomed too early and now they're hiding again because, of course, there was more snowstorms. So it can be very silly stuff like that. They also flip the story. So the actual story was that in December 2016, President-elect stated that he did not need to receive daily intelligence briefings. Now, here's what's kind of interesting about this, is most of us were probably like, oh, that doesn't seem like a very good idea, and then the follow-up would be, but what is the daily intelligence briefing, right? So we actually learned a lot about daily intelligence briefings. It's a practice that was followed by all U.S. presidents beginning in 1946. It was a daily intelligence summary, became more structured in 1964. We've since learned how the presidents like their daily intelligence briefing, having it read to them, having private time to read it themselves in bullet form, in essay form, etc. So the satirical story in The Onion claimed that the president would instead brief the intelligence agencies. So flipping that narrative, something just as simple as flipping that narrative, gives us the opportunity to laugh a little bit, and again, as satire, invites us into the joke. Once we know, or if we already knew, what the daily intelligence briefings were, to hear it, to read it, to see it as a flipped thing, we get to be a part of the joke. The Onion never pretends or purports to be anything other than satire, and the more the headlines of The Onion you read, the more you see its sort of silliness and inviting us into the joke. So how has reality shifted between the real and the satirical stories? In this way, reality is very simply shifted. It's just literally turned over, right? This person to that person as, or this organization to that organization as the person in charge of the information. What tools of persuasion are used to make the satirical story seem on a level plausible? Well, they use all the same language, right? When The Onion is writing, it uses all the same language that's being used in the mainstream news, or mainstream entertainment, because it's not all news in The Onion, and they're using that language to play around with it. Who is the audience of The Onion, and how do they know, or how do we know this story is satire? Well, if you're a regular viewer of it, or reader of it, you're already in on it, right? I have a friend who says that one of the reasons why she fell in love with her husband was because he used to send her Onion headlines, and she just got to laugh every day, and decided that's a pretty good person to marry, right? How or why does this story make us laugh? Well, sometimes it makes us laugh over very silly things. I mean, the idea of the intelligence briefings isn't something that necessarily starts off as silly, but if it's something that we are concerned about, if as voting members of our communities, we are concerned about what seems to be happening in our information, sometimes that opportunity to have a laugh feels pretty good. What level of truth must be understood in order to comprehend the story as satire and therefore as funny? Well, we probably need to know whatever the truth is about intelligence briefings and why this might matter. How does this satire help us make sense of politics? Is again, we're looking at power, right? And The Onion is saying, we're flipping power. We're going to flip power for a paragraph or two and see what that looks like, right? So it's a way in which we can explore power from a position of humor. What is the goal of The Onion in sharing this story? Well, you know what? The Onion's a private company. They need to make money. The Onion has advertisements in it, so their goal is to get us in as readers. Do we happen to be entertained along the way? Probably. But their goal is to get us in as readers. And then how is this story accessed? As I said, when The Onion first started, it was a print publication. It's now exclusively online. You can like it on Facebook, so you get the headlines every day. You can go right to the website. I'm sure they've got some sort of Twitter feed, so on and so forth, right? So we can access it in multiple ways. And then propaganda. Classic propaganda, especially from World War II, used images instead of the written word, or very minimal written words. This was accessible by all, right? If you and I are traveling the streets, right, we are going to our bus stop or to the subway stop or going somewhere and we see the image that we're passing it by, we can catch that on our commute. We don't have to stop and spend a lot of time with it. It's easily consumed, right? The beauty of propaganda, of course, is that we can read it or watch it very, very quickly. It often came with a short and memorable slogan, and it was a quick call to action. There was a quick call to action. In the 21st century, Twitter can be used as a tool of propaganda. People in here are familiar with Twitter? Do I need to give a bit of an explanation of it? It's 140 characters, a very brief sentence. You can get them. You can follow people, you can like people, or you can just go on to Twitter and read the commentary on the screen. You don't have to have it come to you. Tweets are limited to 140 characters. They're short, sharp statements, and they can be sent out to innumerable readers, right? Again, you and I can go look at them online, or we can like people that then will come to us on our phones, and we don't have to go anywhere to read that. They're easy and they're quick to read, and they're nearly impossible to refute without greater evidence than is allowed within the character limits, right? The beauty of 140 characters is you can say something short and sharp, and it's really hard to undo that without more data, right? So we look at some of the tweets, and these are coming to us from a variety of different times, and I do have some of the more recent ones connected to the firing of James Comey. Now, I've done this talk at a couple different places, and I had a student once at a high school who said to me, raised his hand, and he said, but you know, Hillary Clinton, she tweeted too. And I said, you're right, she did. And if she were president, we would absolutely be deconstructing her tweets, because part of what we're doing with critical media literacy is doing that exploration of power, right? That exploration of power. If Hillary Clinton were in the office of the presidency, we would probably be having a different conversation, but I'm not saying it would be above critique. What we're doing here is looking at power and the language that is being used by power, right? So we have from 2016, from November of 2016, this is during the transition. He writes, the failing New York Times story is totally wrong on transition. It is going so smoothly. Also, I have spoken to many foreign leaders, right? So there's a little bit of a disconnect between those sentences, but this was a direct response to the New York Times reporting that the transition out, between administrations seemed to be troublesome, right, and highly disorganized. I would argue that in a way this backfires because by speaking it, it makes it that much more real. But there's also a very difficult, it's hard to refute that. Plus the last sentence, also, I've spoken to many foreign leaders. What are we to do with that? Right? How are we to respond to that? We go back to November of 2012. This is something that comes up in our conversations a lot these days. This is a comment that is continuously being discussed. The concept of global warming was created by and for the Chinese in order to make U.S. manufacturing non-competitive. Right? Our scientists were very upset about this. I was listening on my drive here today. I was listening to NPR talking about a story in Australia on the Great Barrier Reef, which is apparently two-thirds disappeared. The coral, is two-thirds disappeared. And I was listening to the language, and they were saying that, climate change is directly responsible for this. And I was like, well, there's your baseline of perceived truth, is the belief that climate change is a thing, not a hoax perpetuated by the Chinese, right? But again, hard to refute that in 140 characters, right? Hard to refute that in 140 characters. 2015, refugees from Syria are now pouring into our great country. Who knows who they are? Some could be ISIS. Is our president insane? Well, refugees from Syria were never pouring into the United States. There was, again, if we look at evidence, there was never a pouring in of refugees. The question, who knows who they are, some could be, or the statement, who knows who they are, some could be ISIS. But who knows who they are, some could be families, is equally as valid, because we do not know, right? And is our president insane? It's a statement that sort of riles people up, right? If you don't like Barack Obama, you get to go, yeah. And if you do like Barack Obama, maybe you're really not following this line of tweeting, but it's no. How do we respond to that productively and with evidence? And then this one I have here from 2012, in part just because it's continuously confusing to me. While Bette Midler is an extremely unattractive woman, I refuse to say that because I always insist on being politically correct. But you just said it. You actually literally just said it. And it also goes to show in 2012, why are we still commenting on women's looks? Right? What are we doing? That we are either accepting this, agreeing with it, etc. Why are we still commenting on women's looks? Yes?
I think it's this attempt at sarcasm.
Yeah, and so that's where emojis can be helpful because sarcasm is so hard to read written down, right? I get this from students a lot where they'll put in parentheses like, I meant that sarcastically. I'm like, okay, well, sarcasm is pretty tricky written down, right? But even if it's meant as sarcasm, it's still there, right? It's still there. When we look at, these are some of the tweets that came out around the time of the firing of FBI Director James Comey. Fake media is working overtime today. Again, fake media is not a thing. That's an accusation. Again, the story that there was collusion between the Russians and is an excuse fabricated. So when we put all the blame right back on the Democrats, right? We're just sort of shifting the blame, putting it elsewhere, even with no evidence. James Comey better hope that there are no tapes, in quotes, of our conversations before he starts leaking to the press. This was sort of fascinating because that tweet came out the day before James Comey released his memo. It's obviously not a tape, but I think what we can look at here is the idea that this is an effort to control the message, right? And that's so much of what we see is this effort to control the message and whether or not it is effective, right? So to ask questions of propaganda, what is the purpose of these tweets? What are the text and subtext, right? So the explicit are the words being used and the subtext, the implicit or subtle messages. What perspectives or issues are being left out? Well, when we look back at the Chinese as a hoax perpetuated, global warming as a hoax perpetuated by the Chinese, well, there's a ton of perspectives being left out, as well as research, right? Scientific evidence. Does the text or subtext teach tolerance, aggression, or encourage some other response? And what tools of persuasion are used? Strong words, there's no doubt about it. For the audience, who is the intended audience of this text and how is that known? This is a tricky thing because people will follow tweets or follow somebody on Twitter as a way of arguing back to them. So it begs the question of what kind of attention do we give to this, right? If I am an audience of this, am I giving it positive or negative attention might matter less than I am giving it attention. Right. So to what attention, like where is our attention going, and then how do we kind of dissect that a little bit? Who finds pleasure or justification from these tweets? Well, obviously, if you agree with these statements, or if you think that there's some validity to them, or you want to believe that they're true on that emotional level, then they're going to be satisfying. But if you look at them and you say this is problematic, then they're going to be unsatisfying. And then there's a question about what do we do with that? And how do these tweets speak to American fear, right? This is one of the things that we hear a lot about with this election is Americans are afraid. They're afraid of losing jobs and losing security and losing control, and that's how we see this massive shift that has happened. So how do these speak to fear? And then industry and context. In this selection of tweets, which again are just a selection, what messages are sent about gender, about male dominance, race and ethnicity, white privilege, and the construction of the other, right? Because often if we're dealing with something like fear, if we can create an other and create a space where we can put that fear, that might make us feel, for good or for ill, for true or for not true, might make us feel a little bit more secure. And how is good and evil presented in simple terms? And last but not least, how are these tweets accessed? Again, they could come to us on our phones where they're it's in our pockets and we get a notification and all we have to do is push a button, or we could seek them out by going to the Twitter website and looking them up, right? I don't want to leave you without making sure that because I've talked a lot about evidence, so I've got some sources for further exploration, which are on the back of that sheet, but I'd like to use whatever remaining time we have if anybody has any questions or comments, or if there's anything I can clarify. Mm-hmm. But the tricky thing about the word fact is that facts are themselves, we interpret fact, right? And so I think that's one of the things that's happening, right? So our alternative fact first comes to us on the day of the inauguration, right? Where we're seeing pictures of the mall of January 20th, 2017, and pictures of the mall from January of 2008, right? And so those are both facts. How do we interpret those facts? That's where the alternative, I think, comes in. I don't mean to defend it by any stretch of the imagination.
There's no way to defend
Yeah, it's more about trying to sort of figure out what that pathway is. But how does one make sense of propaganda?
Who actually owns owns the creation of alternative fact term as a term?
I believe it was Kellyanne Conway at the inauguration who was the first person who said it. Who was the first person who said to the reporter, well, that's an alternative fact. And you could see, well, I couldn't, but you could see this sort of universe of media outlets that kind of explode with trying to figure out what, because within minutes, it was every other organization talking about what does this alternative fact mean. That's part of spin and part of propaganda is you can't explain it through logical or rational.
Oh, this is even beyond that.
Yeah, yeah. It's not about logic and rationality. It's about emotion, and it's about emotion, base emotional responses. Yes, because when we are confused and when we are insecure, we are less likely to do, right? So if you watch the news, oftentimes at the end, especially the end of local news, national news does it too. The morning news shows do this all the time. They always end on something upbeat. Because if we turn off our TVs sad, we don't do. And what we're not doing then is we're not buying, right? We're less likely to consume. We actually have to be just the right amount of depressed to go into consumer therapy, right? Anything more than that, and we're not consuming. And if our eyeballs are to be delivered to the advertisers, we are to consume, right? That is what we are to do. So when we are at a certain point of discomfort and insecurity, we are less likely to do certain things, like maybe send a letter or go to a march or make a phone call or engage in a conversation, and more likely to go, I need more information so that I know what's going on. And then we get ourselves into this cycle of continuously needing more without getting actually more information. Sometimes really the healthiest thing to do is to turn it off. You know, I mean, I'll sit here and I'll give you all sorts of techniques, and please take the handouts and have the questions. And sometimes I think the best piece of advice, turn it off. Go for a walk in the woods, you know, because our brains are neurologically can only handle so much before it's overload. So I think that sparking that insecurity is beneficial to keeping us. Yes, of course, beneficial to someone for keeping us in a sort of very small space. But some propaganda also invites us in a little bit. I think people believe largely based on emotion and feeling, right? I need this, I want this to be true, or I want it to be false. But I think that's part of what critical media literacy does, is that it helps us become skeptical rather than cynical. We're not, as critical media literacy scholars, we're not, kicking all this information to the curb, going, I'm throwing it all out. Because I don't know how helpful that is. But it's asking these questions of our data. Why is this here? What is the motivation? What am I getting? What are the word choices here? If I can eliminate some of these adjectives, am I going to get a different story, right? But that takes time. That takes time. And that takes us slowing down. And that's definitely something we are not encouraged to do today. We are encouraged to do things quickly, to do them on the fly. And sound bites, right? We are encouraged to believe that a soundbite and a headline is all the data we need. That's risky. Yeah, I mean, I think we can do a lot of critical media literacy with headlines, and we can do a lot with critical media literacy with sound bites, but we still need to get into the story. And we still need to ask those questions of the story. And maybe that means we do more with less. I mean, before the election, I was reading everything I could get my hands on, including all the material, like all the press that was in opposition to my beliefs, because it was just, I was so overwhelmed and so flabbergasted by everything that was happening. And yeah, you know what? It didn't change my mind, but I also don't think I learned a ton by reading that much more, by reading that much more. And yet, I will also be the first to say, there is just that much more to read. I work with an organization in Northern California called Project Censored. Project Censored does, one of the big things that they do is publish a book every year on the top underreported news stories. Right? And in the book, there are 25 news stories, right, that have been underreported by the mainstream press. And I was asked this year to review the stories that they were considering. And I was like, great, I'd love to do this. This is fabulous. And I, checked I opened my email at work and I looked at my watch and I was like, I got about 10 minutes, I'll do this now. I opened the document, there were 200 stories. I was only allowed to choose 15. And I was like, so much for thinking that I'm pretty well informed, and I'm certainly not getting this done in 10 minutes. And I carved out a chunk of the next day because I was like, here I am thinking that I kind of know what's going on, and I've still got a lot to learn. And it was fascinating. And I know that they're doing the voting, they're sort of making the decisions now. And I'm very curious as to see, but that was 200 stories that will be narrowed down to 25. And chances are most of us don't even know those 25. I think that the way that I look at it is these are companies that are looking to make money, and how are they going to make their money? And so part of the way that they're making their money is knowing who their audience parts are, right? And we might hear about Fox, the ratings on Fox or the ratings on MSNBC, but Fox knows exactly who its audience is and who it's going to be, and MSNBC knows who its audience is and who it's going to be. And so, no, I don't think that there is a liberal bias. I think that there's probably more of an economic bias. Right? So we think back a few years ago when GE was the corporate owner of NBC, and one of the big things that GE does, most of us know GE for light bulbs, but one of the big things that GE does is they make bombs. You're not hearing that story on NBC. Right? Now NBC is owned by Comcast, which is the largest cable provider in the United States. You and I, if we are Comcast customers, I don't know what the cable is here. It's Comcast. You're most likely going to have pretty easy access to NBC channels. And you might watch those channels and go, gosh, this is so convenient. I have these channels. Well, it's because it's in their best interest, right? So we sort of climb that ladder a little bit and say who owns this and what is their motivation and why am I getting what looks to be competing products, but are ultimately owned by the same corporate entity. So thank you very much. And thank you. And if there's anything else, again, as I said, this is about building community. So this is the end of this conversation right now, but it's not the end of the conversation at large.